Welcome back to returning listeners and welcome to new listeners. This is 1 year on. I'm Alison. And following on from episode 4, today's episode is about the emotional journey of dealing with something so huge as a stroke, including the emotions I was dealing with in the early days. I need to provide a trigger warning, as this will deal with some things which may be upsetting for you and include the description of my experience with panic attack. I've been really thinking on how to explain to you about my emotions around my experience of stroke. In the beginning, they were very changeable. Firstly, numb. I think really numb. But it even started before that. When I was first experiencing a change in my capabilities, I was bewildered in that I didn't understand why this was happening. By the time I reached hospital, I was extremely fearful, terrified when I heard that my blood pressure was as high as it was. I knew that couldn't be good. When I was on the ward and there were all those noises, the bing bong of the machines that were connected to me, and when I was extremely fatigued, I was exhausted and irritable. Definitely having energy and enough rest and sleep is very important to me to have resilience. When I was told I'd had a stroke, in a way I was relieved as it explained why I'd been feeling so strange. And then when I was at home, the emotions changed in a way that was a roller coaster. I ended up spending most of the days on my own because my kids were at school, husband was at work. They couldn't and didn't stop their normal lives for me, nor should they have. I was able to be at home, recovering myself, and certainly could do everything for myself and didn't need help. Thankfully, that capability hadn't changed. It was very isolating, though. I had never in all of my adult life been at home so much, apart from when I was on maternity leave. I have always worked and been in the office with my colleagues. That change was very hard, and I missed my colleagues hugely. There was a huge grief and sorrow over being wrenched away from them. In general, though, I live in my head, always thinking, pondering everything, overthinking. Now, some of you will remember I said coming home from hospital I'd no thoughts in my head. I really have no memories of that time other than the sense of what I was thinking, how I was feeling, because it was a nothing. When I finally got thoughts back, the numbness, I think, was improving, and then went into a length of time where I was deeply fearful, a time of terror almost. I had the heartbug monitor taking in real-time data from my heart. Also, it was connected to my mobile phone by an app, and I could look at it. It would show what my heartbeats looked like and the way my heart was working with a trace. It's a good and a bad thing because you can overthink this, of course, and being the overchronic thinker that I am, the monitor had a function where you could indicate to the scientists analysing the data that there was something going on, where you think there is actually something wrong. In that month, when I had the monitor, I pressed that button twice, I think. It was heartening to see the heart trace as regular, and it looked like what you thought that it should look like. I was also very tearful at almost anything. On social media, I cried at every animal video I watched. To the news and general happenings, I would feel the tears welling up in my eyes. But I didn't cry as such. It was just very weird. I spent much of the time with tears being ever present. This continued for many weeks, months even. Even now, tears are closer to the surface on a reasonably regular basis. At Easter, I had been in a space of being incredibly fearful and worried that I would have another stroke. I had been reading into stroke, the prevalence of it, reading about basal ganglia strokes and the prognosis. Oh, I shouldn't really have done that, but what can you do? The sources that I was reading were really reputable websites. But what was not good for me was reading that 70% of people who have basal ganglia strokes die. I think I missed the bit about it being people who have basal ganglia strokes by aneurysm, the bleed, rather than basal ganglia strokes with the blood clot, which is ischemic. But that is a pretty grim statistic to be reading when you know that basal ganglia is right in the middle of your brain, and that is what was affected for you. I got to this point of overthinking, fear and terror, where I was convinced, really convinced, that if I went to sleep that night, I would not wake up. I was sitting on my bed, sobbing for 4 hours, utterly bereft. Thoughts of how would my husband cope with me gone? How would my kids cope with me gone? How would he even contact everyone I knew that maybe he didn't know that I was gone? Would I ever see my family again? How would I? It was a really awful time and I was simply in a terrible place. I wasn't suicidal, that was not it at all, but I wasn't ready or willing to die. This was the real realization that I was not immortal, that mortality is an instant where anything and everything can and could change. We all know we aren't immortal. We know that as fact. But do we actually feel that on a day-to-day basis? I don't think we really do. But this was me utterly confronting that fact in a way that brought absolute terror to me. I was frozen on the bed, sobbing, sobbing, sobbing. I was finally able to calm down enough to sleep when my husband came to bed, and he held me and did what he could to comfort me. I had about 3 hours of sleep that night, and on waking in the morning, I was thanking every god and goddess for bringing me back for another day. I still give thanks to the universe when I wake each morning. I stumbled through the following day, which was Easter Monday, and taking the dogs to the dog park that evening. I didn't really feel right. I was sat in the car and only able to whisper. We didn't make it to the dog park, and my husband turned the car around and came back to the house, saying, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to go back to hospital." The poor dogs were taken back into the house without their off-lead run, and that must have been really bewildering for them. And he brought out my handbag and various things because we knew that going to hospital would mean a lengthy wait. Back at the hospital, I was once again connected up to machines and my blood pressure was very high. Now, bearing in mind, I was on 2 different blood pressure medications and my blood pressure was still high. I remember the nurse asking me various questions. "Do you know the date?" "Oh, yes, I do. It's the 1st of April, and this is not an April Fool." What a terrible joke that would be if it was. I wasn't out the back again so quickly this time. I had to wait a little while out in the emergency room, the emergency waiting room, which was so bright. I gripped onto his hand. He had abandoned the car in the ambulance bay, which is right next to emergency. It was safely positioned, not getting in the way of the ambulances, but this isn't a place where anyone is allowed to park. I couldn't get into the hospital on my own, so he walked in with me. I was able to answer the questions that they had, but only in a whisper. And I felt my hands going tingly, and the nurse said that I was hyperventilating. There was fear everywhere around. When I finally got taken out the bag, I had to go on my own, and my husband had to move the car. I didn't want him to leave me and was gripping his hand so tightly. He had to, though, as he was in danger having the cops slap a ticket on the car or worse, tow it away. The doctors and nurses were so lovely. I don't remember much of that period now, except them having a lot of trouble putting a needle into me for a cannula, and me telling one of the doctors I wasn't leaving until they could find out what was wrong with me. I was in my bay with a towel over my eyes, as I simply couldn't tolerate the bright lights, and my voice was a whisper. The doctor said she would move me to the emergency department ward, which wasn't the acute space of emergency, but a space which was quieter and they were allowed to turn the lights out. So I went there, and firstly I was sharing with an older lady who seemed quite sweet. She went away to sleep with the TV on, but so quiet it was okay. I was hypervigilant. Every little noise was as if it was a megaphone. And I had this lovely nurse. I'm sure her name was Emily, or she had a sister called Emily. She was trying to do an EEG on me and all those cables. There was a fellow brought in with his own police entourage. They sat on the seats beside his bed with a laptop, which they were tapping on, and walkie-talkies which went off all the time. The 2 cops changed every 2 hours. I'm sure they changed twice through the night. They weren't noisy, but their presence was a disruption. They then moved this patient, and a new patient arrived. An older person who'd been on bowel prep for colonoscopy and hadn't taken their normal medications, and they had collapsed. And on it went. I still had extreme fear, extreme worry about having another stroke and more damage to my recovering brain. In the morning, it brought the rounds, and an emergency department doctor, who was Scottish, turned up. I could hear her outside and thought, oh no, I don't want to have her come. And here she was in front of me. She was really lovely, actually. And in fact, she pinpointed exactly what was happening. I'd had a panic attack. There was nothing they could do in the hospital, as nothing was showing up on the second CT scan. It showed the one stroke, but nothing more. My bloods were all fine. Nothing showed up, especially unusual from the many cables the heart monitoring was doing. So there was nothing for them to actually treat. And they didn't treat high blood pressure in hospital because being an emergency is a stress overload. So they don't treat that. Then we had a discussion about the emotional journey after stroke. It's like the grief process, and I had to deal with that, get psychological help, and move on. So I packed up out of hospital for a second time in 2.5 weeks, straight to my GP, where I was crying and whispering to her about what had happened. That was my really lowest point. Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. I will be back next time to describe how I handled life in the first month as I grappled to deal with what actually happened to me. Thank you.